They taught you about the railways, the legal systems, the civilizing mission, the great British Empire that spread order across a chaotic world. Nobody taught you about the 3 million Bengalis who starved while Britain exported their food. Nobody taught you about the children who died in British concentration camps in South Africa. Nobody taught you about the men castrated with pliers in Kenyan detention camps while London signed off on the programme. Nobody taught you about the 450,000 Africans who died in chains before their ship ever reached shore. The British Empire was the largest in human history. It controlled a quarter of the planet. Nearly 500 million people lived under it. And the story told about it, in classrooms, in museums, in political speeches, has been cleaned up so thoroughly that most people living in countries the empire built have no real idea what it actually did. These are 101 facts about what it actually did. Every single one is documented. Every single one is real. And almost none of them were in your textbook. The largest empire in human history. At its absolute peak in 1922, the British Empire covered approximately 13.7 million square miles of the Earth's surface. To put that into perspective, the entire continent of Africa is about 11.7 million square miles. The British Empire was bigger than that. It stretched across every single continent on the planet. North America, South America, Africa, Asia, Australia, and dozens of island chains scattered across every major ocean. It included modern-day countries as varied as Canada, India, South Africa, Australia, Egypt, Kenya, Jamaica, Singapore, Nigeria, and scores of others. The empire controlled vast deserts, enormous river systems, mountain ranges, coastlines, and agricultural heartlands. It held the world's most important trade routes, including the Suez Canal and the sea lanes connecting Europe to Asia. No empire before or since has ever come close to controlling this proportion of the planet's land surface simultaneously. When historians call it the largest empire in recorded human history, they are not being dramatic, they are just reading the map. Rome at its peak controlled about 2 million square miles. The British Empire was nearly 7 times larger. 2. 1 in 5 people on Earth lived under British rule. At the peak of the British Empire, approximately 458 million people lived under British authority. In the early 1920s, the total population of the entire planet was estimated at around 1.8 billion people. That means roughly 1 in every 5 human beings alive at that time was a subject of the British Crown, whether they wanted to be or not. These were people in India, across Africa, throughout the Caribbean, in parts of the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific Islands, and in the white settler colonies of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. They spoke hundreds of different languages, practiced dozens of different religions, lived in climates ranging from Arctic to tropical, and had histories stretching back thousands of years before a British ship ever appeared on their horizon. The overwhelming majority of them had no vote, no meaningful legal protection against the colonial administration, no representation in British Parliament, and no mechanism to challenge decisions made thousands of miles away in London. They were subjects of an empire they had not chosen and could not leave. That is 458 million people living under a political system imposed entirely by force. 3. The sun literally never set on it. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was not a boast or an exaggeration. It was a simple geographical fact. Because Britain controlled territory spread across every time zone on the planet, there was no moment in the day when the sun was not shining on at least one British-controlled piece of land somewhere on Earth. When it was night in London, it was daytime in India. When it was night in India, it was daytime in Australia. When it was night in Australia, it was daytime in Canada or the Caribbean. This went on for well over a century without interruption. The phrase was originally used by Scottish writer John Wilson in 1829 and was quickly adopted as a source of imperial pride. It appeared on maps, in speeches, in school books, and in propaganda throughout the Victorian and Edwardian eras. Children across Britain were taught to see this as proof of their nation's greatness. What was rarely taught alongside it was how that global reach was achieved and maintained, what it cost the people living inside that empire, and what methods were used every single time a piece of that territory tried to leave. 4. Britain has invaded almost every country on Earth. Historian Stuart Laycock spent years researching British military history for his 2012 book and reached a conclusion that shocked many people when it was published. According to his research, Britain has at some point invaded, conducted military operations in, or established a military presence inside approximately 171 of the roughly 193 countries that exist in the world today. That leaves only around 22 nations that have been entirely untouched by British military force throughout history. Those 22 include countries like Monaco, Guatemala, Tajikistan, and the Marshall Islands. Almost everywhere else has at some point experienced a British military presence, a British gunboat, a British punitive expedition, a British-backed coup, or an outright British invasion. This is not a statistic that gets taught in British schools. The history curriculum in the United Kingdom tends to focus on specific campaigns, Waterloo, the World Wars, the Falklands, rather than the cumulative picture of a nation that used military force more widely and more consistently than virtually any other in modern history. The 171 country figure covers a span of several hundred years, but its breadth across every continent and region on Earth says something fundamental about how the empire was built and sustained. 5. It lasted over 400 years. The British Empire officially began in 1583, when Sir Humphrey Gilbert claimed Newfoundland in present-day Canada for the English crown, making it the first formal English colonial possession. It effectively ended in 1997, when Hong Kong was handed back to China, the last major British colonial territory to be transferred. That is a span of over 400 years of continuous imperial operation. Along the way, the empire went through several distinct phases. It began as an Atlantic enterprise focused on the Americas and the slave trade. It expanded dramatically through the East India Company's conquest of the Indian subcontinent. It then entered the era of the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, absorbing vast portions of that continent in a matter of decades. After the First and Second World Wars, it began its long retreat as independence movements successfully pushed Britain out of territories across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. Some departures were relatively peaceful, many were not. The 400-year span means that no single generation of British people was responsible for the empire's full history. But it also means that the institutions, wealth, and global influence that Britain still holds today were built and accumulated across that entire period. The slave trade. 6. Britain became the world's biggest slave trader. By the 1730s, Britain had become the single largest slave trading nation on the planet, overtaking Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and France to dominate the transatlantic trade in enslaved human beings. This did not happen by accident. It happened because the British government actively supported, legally protected, and financially encouraged the trade at every stage. The Royal African Company, founded in 1660 and backed by the English Crown, established a network of forts and trading posts along the West African coast. After its monopoly was broken in 1698, the trade was opened to independent merchants, and the ports of London, Bristol, and Liverpool expanded rapidly to accommodate the explosion in slaving voyages. British banks financed the voyages. British manufacturers supplied the goods that were traded in Africa for enslaved people. British insurance companies insured the ships and their human cargo. British plantation owners in the Caribbean and North America purchased the enslaved people at auction. The profits from the entire system flowed back to Britain and funded everything from the country houses of the English aristocracy to the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. For over a century, the British economy was deeply and deliberately built on the bodies of enslaved Africans. 7. British ships transported 3.4 million Africans between 1640 and 1807. British ships transported approximately 3.4 million African people across the Atlantic Ocean as enslaved cargo. These were not abstract numbers. They were individual human beings, taken from communities across West and Central Africa, from what is now Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, Angola, Benin, Sierra Leone, and dozens of other regions. They were separated from their families, marched to coastal forts and holding pens called barracoons, branded with hot irons, and loaded onto ships in conditions deliberately designed to maximize the number of bodies per vessel rather than the survival of the people inside it. Men were typically chained together in pairs, forced to lie in spaces so tight they could not turn over. Women and children were kept separately, but in equally brutal conditions. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, typically lasted between 6 and 12 weeks. People died from dysentery, smallpox, dehydration, and despair. Some jumped overboard deliberately. Slave ship captains were experienced enough to know a certain percentage would not survive, and they loaded accordingly, factoring death into the economics of the voyage as a normal business calculation. The 3.4 million figure represents only those transported in British-flagged vessels. 8. 450,000 Africans died just on the crossing of the approximately 3.4 million African people loaded onto British slave ships between 1640 and 1807. Around 450,000 died before the ships ever reached their destination. That is nearly 500,000 human beings who died at sea, in chains, in the hold of a cargo vessel, without ever seeing the shore they were being taken to. They died from the conditions imposed on them deliberately by the economics of the trade. The Middle Passage was designed to pack as many bodies into as small a space as possible to maximize profit per voyage. The result was a floating death environment. Dysentery, which sailors called the bloody flux, spread rapidly through the tightly packed holds. Smallpox and measles tore through populations with no immunity. People died from dehydration when rations of water were cut. People died from the infections caused by chains cutting into their wrists and ankles over weeks at sea. People were beaten to death for resisting or refusing to eat. The mortality rate on British slave ships varied by voyage and period, but averaged around 12 to 13%. Ship captains noted deaths in their logs the same way they noted spoiled cargo, as a financial loss, not a human one. 9. Britain ran a third of all slave voyages. British ports were responsible for outfitting nearly 1/3 of every transatlantic slave voyage ever conducted. That means out of all the ships that ever crossed the Atlantic carrying enslaved Africans, across all the centuries the trade operated, and across all the European nations involved, British ships accounted for approximately 1 in every 3 voyages. The ports of Liverpool, London, and Bristol were the operational centres of this system. Liverpool alone funded and dispatched more slave voyages than any other city in Europe during the peak years of the trade. The ships left Britain loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, firearms, metalwork, alcohol, which were traded on the West African coast in exchange for enslaved people. The ships then crossed the Atlantic, sold their human cargo in the Caribbean and North America, and returned to Britain loaded with sugar, tobacco, coffee, and cotton, produced by the enslaved people they had just delivered. This 3-leg journey, Britain to Africa, to the Americas, to Britain, was called the triangular trade, and it was one of the most profitable commercial systems in human history. The profits built Bristol's Georgian architecture, financed Liverpool's docks, and funded London's financial institutions. 10. Britain banked £60 million from slave sales in 46 years. Between 1761 and 1807, a period of just 46 years, British ports earned £60 million from the sale of enslaved African people. Adjusted for inflation and converted into modern values, that figure equates to approximately £8 billion today. This money did not simply disappear into abstract financial records. It was invested in real things that still exist. Country houses were built with it. Banks were established with it. The infrastructure of several British cities was funded directly by it. Historians at University College London spent years tracing exactly where the money went through the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project, and what they found was that the profits from slavery were woven into virtually every sector of the British economy. The men who made fortunes in the slave trade and on Caribbean plantations invested in insurance companies, textile mills, railways, and banking houses. Their descendants inherited those investments and the social positions that came with them. Several British institutions that still exist and still operate today, including banks, insurance companies, and trading firms, can trace significant portions of their founding capital directly back to the trade in enslaved human beings. 11. John Hawkins launched Britain's slave trade under the Queen's blessing. The first British slave voyage was conducted by a Plymouth-born sailor named John Hawkins in 1562, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Hawkins sailed to the coast of West Africa, where he kidnapped or purchased approximately 300 African people, then transported them across the Atlantic and sold them to Spanish colonists in the Caribbean. The profit he made was enormous, and when he returned to England, Queen Elizabeth I was reportedly so pleased with the financial returns that she agreed to personally invest in his second voyage, providing him with a ship from the Royal Fleet called the Jesus of Lubeck. Hawkins made 3 voyages between 1562 and 1569, transporting an estimated 1,200 Africans to Hispaniola and other parts of the Caribbean. The Queen's direct participation in the early slave trade was not a secret at the time. After his second voyage, Elizabeth reportedly awarded Hawkins a coat of arms that featured a bound African figure, a visual celebration of what he had done. Hawkins is widely recognised by historians as the pioneer of English participation in the transatlantic slave trade, and the fact that the English crown was involved from the very beginning is a fundamental part of that history. 12. The royal family had a direct financial stake in the slave trade. The Royal African Company, the first major British corporation established specifically to trade in enslaved Africans, was not just backed by the government. Members of the royal family had a direct personal financial interest in it. The company was founded in 1660 with royal patronage, and the Duke of York, who later became King James II, was among its most prominent early investors and supporters. Under the terms of the company's charter, the monarch received a financial return from the trade. The branding mark used on enslaved Africans shipped by the Royal African Company was the letters D.Y. for Duke of York, burned into their skin. This was not a private commercial operation that happened to involve some distant relatives of the Crown. It was a venture in which members of the British royal family were personally and financially invested in the buying, transportation, branding, and selling of human beings. The current British royal family has acknowledged that research into the royal family's historical links to slavery is a matter of legitimate historical inquiry. King Charles III has commissioned research into the monarchy's connections to the slave trade, though no full public accounting has yet been produced. 13. The king gave one company a monopoly to own African people for 1,000 years. In 1672, King Charles II granted the Royal African Company an extraordinary legal privilege. He gave the company a monopoly on the trade in enslaved Africans to supply British colonies, and the terms of that monopoly were specified to last for 1,000 years. This was not a temporary emergency measure or a short-term commercial arrangement. It was a permanent legal structure designed to lock in British access to enslaved African labour for a millennium. Under this monopoly, no other British merchant could legally transport enslaved Africans to British colonies without the company's permission. The company built a network of forts and trading posts along the West African coast, including Cormontin, Cape Coast Castle, and James Island, where enslaved people were held in underground dungeons, sometimes for months, before being loaded onto ships. Over the following 20 years after the 1672 Charter, the company exported more than 90,000 enslaved Africans to the Americas. The monopoly was eventually broken in 1698 after pressure from independent merchants in Bristol and Liverpool who wanted access to the trade's profits. Opening the business to independent operators caused the volume of the British slave trade to increase dramatically, rather than decrease. 14. 130 enslaved people were thrown overboard alive for insurance money. In 1781, the captain of a British slave ship called the Zong made a calculation that historians still point to as one of the clearest illustrations of exactly how the slave trade worked. The ship had left the coast of West Africa with around 470 enslaved Africans aboard, but it had run dangerously low on water after navigational errors extended the voyage. Sick and dying enslaved people on board reduced the profit of the voyage because the insurance policy covering the ship only paid out for enslaved people lost at sea, not for those who died from illness. So the captain ordered the crew to throw living people overboard. At least 130 enslaved Africans were murdered in this way. When the owners filed an insurance claim for their deaths, the insurers refused to pay, and the case went to a British court. The court's ruling did not focus on whether murder had been committed. It focused on the insurance contract. The legal discussion treated the 130 murdered human beings as cargo, no different from damaged goods thrown overboard to save a ship. The case became a landmark in the early British abolitionist movement and was cited repeatedly by campaigners as evidence of what the trade had reduced human life to. 15. A third of enslaved people died within 3 years of arrival. For the enslaved Africans who survived the Middle Passage and were sold to plantation owners in the Caribbean, death did not wait long. Historical records show that approximately 1/3 of newly imported enslaved people died within their first 3 years on British Caribbean plantations. The conditions on these plantations were deliberately brutal. The British West Indies, particularly Jamaica, Barbados and Antigua, ran what were effectively agricultural factories. Sugarcane required year-round labour, including during harvest when workers were pushed to work around the clock for days at a time. Heat, disease, malnutrition, brutal physical punishment, and the total denial of any human rights combined to produce death rates that meant the plantation system could only sustain itself through continuous importation of new enslaved people. This is why the British slave trade never stopped growing until it was legislated out of existence. Planters did not invest in keeping enslaved workers alive beyond their immediate productive usefulness. It was cheaper to work someone to death and buy a replacement than to maintain a living population. This was not an unintended consequence of the system. It was built into the economics of how British Caribbean plantations operated for over 150 years. 16. Slave owners were paid £20 million. The enslaved got nothing. When the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, it included a financial compensation package. The people who received that compensation were not the formerly enslaved. They were the people who had owned them. The British government paid out £20 million to slave owners, people who had profited for generations from forced, unpaid labour, torture, and the sale of human beings, as compensation for the loss of their property. The formerly enslaved received nothing, not a penny in compensation for lifetimes of unpaid work, not support for the transition to freedom, not land, not tools, not legal protections to help them establish independent lives. The £20 million paid to slave owners in 1833 represented approximately 40% of the entire British government's annual budget at the time. It was an enormous sum of public money, used to compensate the people running the system, rather than the people the system had been run against. The payout was not a secret or an obscure historical footnote. It was a formal government transaction recorded in official accounts. It tells you clearly who the British government believed deserved compensation and who it did not. 17. British taxpayers were still paying a debt tied to slave owner compensation in 2015. The £20 million paid to slave owners in 1833 did not come from existing government funds. Britain borrowed the money. The loan taken out to fund slave owner compensation was so large that it took the British government 182 years to fully pay it off. In 2018, the UK government's own HM Treasury Twitter account noted that British taxpayers had only finished repaying the final instalments of that debt in 2015. That means people alive today, people who were born, went to school, got jobs, and paid taxes in the United Kingdom, had their tax contributions go towards servicing a financial obligation created to compensate people who had owned other human beings. This is not a metaphorical or theoretical connection between modern Britain and the slave trade. It is a literal financial one. The children and grandchildren of enslaved people received no compensation. The great-great-grandchildren of enslaved people received no compensation. But British taxpayers in 2015 were still paying the interest on the loan that compensated the people who had enslaved their ancestors. This fact was publicly confirmed by a British government account and then widely shared because many people found it almost impossible to believe. 18. Britain kept legalised slavery alive in its colonies until 1937. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 is frequently presented as the end of British slavery. It was not. The Act abolished slavery across most British territory, but it contained exclusions and was applied unevenly. More importantly, it left intact the internal land-based trade in enslaved people in certain British colonial territories. It was not until 1937, over 100 years after the famous Abolition Act, that the internal slave trade was fully outlawed across all British colonial possessions. The last British territories to formally end the practice of slavery were Nigeria and Bahrain, both in 1936 and 1937 respectively. This means that during the 1930s, while Britain was presenting itself to the world as a civilised, modern, democratic power, while it was hosting the 1937 Paris Peace Conference, while it was negotiating with Hitler, while it was broadcasting the first television service in the world, enslaved people were still being bought and sold under British colonial authority in parts of Africa and the Middle East. The 1833 Act has a justified place in history as a milestone, but teaching it as the end of British slavery, full stop, is historically incomplete. The full end came more than a century later, quietly, without ceremony. 19. Freed slaves were forced to keep working for their former owners. When the Slavery Abolition Act came into force in 1834, it did not free enslaved people immediately. It created a legal status called apprenticeship, under which formerly enslaved people were required to continue working for their former owners, for free, for a further 4 to 6 years before being allowed to leave. The argument made at the time was that formerly enslaved people needed a period of transition and preparation before they could handle freedom. The practical effect was that the plantation system continued operating without paying wages for 4 more years after the formal abolition of slavery. Apprentices were required to work 40.5 hours per week for their former enslavers without pay. They could be flogged for refusing. They could be imprisoned. The apprenticeship system was not the spontaneous result of well-meaning but misguided policy. It was a direct concession to the plantation owners and their representatives in Parliament, who feared the economic disruption of losing their free labour force overnight. System was eventually abolished in 1838, 2 years ahead of schedule, after campaigners documented the widespread abuse of apprentices and public outrage grew. But for 4 years after abolition, the plantation economy continued running on forced, unpaid labour. 20. Liverpool dispatched more slave ships than any city in Europe. The city of Liverpool in northwest England was the undisputed capital of the British slave trade during its peak years. Between 1699 and 1807, Liverpool-based merchants funded and dispatched an estimated 5,300 slave voyages, more than any other city in Europe during the same period. At its peak in the 1790s, Liverpool was the departure point for roughly 80% of all British slave ships. The city's economy was built around the trade in every possible direction. Shipbuilders constructed the vessels, sailmakers supplied the canvas, rope makers supplied the rigging, manufacturers supplied the trade goods, insurance companies covered the risks. Banks financed the voyages and held the accounts. The profits that returned to Liverpool from each successful voyage were invested in the city itself, in its docks, its warehouses, its streets, its public buildings, and the private homes of its merchants. Many of the most prominent buildings in Liverpool that still stand today were built with money made directly from the sale of enslaved human beings. The slave trade made Liverpool one of the wealthiest cities in Britain. When the trade was abolished in 1807, Liverpool's merchants lobbied furiously against abolition because they understood exactly what they stood to lose. The Bengal famine of 1943, 21. 3 million people died in a famine that was not caused by drought. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed approximately 3 million people in the Indian region of Bengal, which includes modern-day West Bengal and Bangladesh. It is one of the worst famines in recorded history. What makes it particularly significant is what did not cause it. Researchers from the Indian Institute of Technology, the India Meteorology Department, and the University of California, Los Angeles analysed historical soil moisture data going back to 1870 and studied 6 major Indian famines between 1873 and 1943. Their findings, published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters, were stark. For every other major famine in that 70-year period, there was evidence of drought and crop failure in the soil data. For the 1943 Bengal famine, there was no such evidence. The soil moisture data for Bengal in 1943 was actually above normal. The crop that year was sufficient to feed the population. 3 million people died not because there was no food, but because a series of policy decisions made by the British colonial administration prevented them from getting it. The researchers described the famine as the result of a complete policy failure. The distinction matters enormously because a natural disaster is a tragedy. A policy failure is a choice. 22. The food was there, the British took it anyway. When 3 million people were dying in Bengal in 1943, the food to prevent those deaths was available. The 1943 harvest in Bengal was not a disaster. There was no catastrophic crop failure. What happened was that the British wartime administration made a series of decisions that directed food away from the Bengali civilian population. British authorities stockpiled large quantities of food to supply the military forces defending India against a potential Japanese invasion. Significant quantities of food were exported from India to supply British forces in the Middle East and to build up stockpiles for the eventual liberation of occupied European countries. At the same time, the administration imposed a denial policy in coastal Bengal, destroying boats, carts and elephants to prevent them falling into Japanese hands if an invasion came. The result was that the food distribution system in rural Bengal collapsed. Food was in the country, but it could not move to where people were dying because the transport infrastructure had been deliberately destroyed. The people who needed the food most, the rural poor, the farmers, the labourers, had no means to reach it and no political power to demand it. They died while the food sat in military stores. 23. Churchill blocked aid to Bengal while people starved. As the Bengal famine was killing people in enormous numbers, the Indian government sent repeated requests to Winston Churchill's War Cabinet in London for emergency food shipments. Those requests were denied or delayed on multiple occasions. The War Cabinet was aware of what was happening in Bengal. The numbers of dead were being reported to London. The scale of the crisis was documented in diplomatic and administrative cables. Churchill's position was that the war effort had to take priority. The shipping resources required to bring food to Bengal were needed for other purposes. Critics, including historian Madhushri Mukherjee, whose research drew on War Cabinet records, argued that Churchill's administration made active choices to prioritise other destinations over Bengal. Ship records from the period showed Australian wheat being routed to Ceylon, the Middle East and southern Africa. Every direction in the Indian Ocean except toward India. Secretary of State for India, Leopold Amery, privately noted that Churchill showed an active hostility toward the idea of diverting resources to feed Indians. The War Cabinet's own records show requests for food relief to Bengal being rejected at the same time that food was being sent to territories far less urgently in need. 24. Churchill's documented response to the death toll was contempt. When the British administration in Delhi sent a telegram to Winston Churchill informing him of the staggering death toll in Bengal and the ongoing scale of the disaster, his documented response was to ask why Gandhi had not died yet. This was not an isolated comment. Churchill made multiple recorded statements about Indians and about the Bengal famine that reflected a fundamental contempt for the people dying. He described Indians as a beastly people with a beastly religion. He stated that the famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. During a war cabinet meeting in which the Bengal food crisis was being discussed, he reportedly drew what colleagues described as a vivid picture of British workers in rags struggling to pay wealthy Indian mill owners, framing the question of whether to send food to Bengal in terms of British sacrifice rather than Indian survival. Field Marshal Archibald Wavell, who became Viceroy of India in 1943 and worked to end the famine, recorded in his diary that Churchill showed a profound lack of concern for Indian lives. These are not allegations. They are documented in war cabinet minutes, personal diaries of people present in those meetings, and official correspondence held in the British National Archives. 25. The science confirmed what the critics had always said. For decades after 1943, the standard British position on the Bengal famine was that it was a tragedy compounded by the difficulties of war, shipping shortages, the threat of Japanese invasion, global logistical pressures. Churchill's defenders argued that he sent food once the scale of the disaster became clear, and that blaming him personally was an unfair oversimplification. Then the scientific evidence arrived. The 2019 study, published in Geophysical Research Letters, was not a political argument or a post-colonial interpretation. It was a peer-reviewed climate science analysis. It reconstructed soil moisture and agricultural conditions across India for every major famine between 1870 and 2016. The result was unambiguous. Every other major famine showed clear evidence of drought. The 1943 famine showed none. The famine that killed 3 million Bengalis was not caused by drought, crop failure, or any natural disaster. It was caused by policy. This finding aligned with what Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen had argued in 1981, that famines in democracies are essentially impossible because governments that face elections will not let their voters starve. The Bengal famine happened because the people dying had no political power over the people making the decisions. That is what colonialism looked like in practice. 26. The British destroyed the transport infrastructure of the very region they said they were protecting. One of the most consequential decisions made by British authorities in Bengal before the 1943 famine was the denial policy implemented in coastal areas in 1942. Fearing a Japanese invasion following the fall of Burma, British administrators ordered the confiscation and destruction of boats, carts, bicycles, and working animals, including elephants, in the Chittagong and coastal Bengal areas. The logic was straightforward from a military standpoint. If the Japanese invaded, they should not be able to use Bengal's transport infrastructure. The effect on the civilian population was catastrophic. Rural Bengal's economy depended on small boats to move rice between districts, carts to carry food to market, and animals to do agricultural work. When the British destroyed those assets, they destroyed the food distribution network of one of the most densely populated rural regions on Earth. When the famine hit in 1943, food could not move to where people were dying. The people who needed food most had no means of transport to reach it. Fishing communities lost their boats and their livelihoods simultaneously. The denial policy was a military decision made without any meaningful consideration of what it would do to the people who lived in those areas. They were not warned. They were not compensated. They were just left with nothing. 27. The Bengal government never officially declared a famine. Throughout the worst months of the 1943 Bengal famine, as people died by the hundreds of thousands on the streets of Calcutta and in the rural districts of Bengal, the British-administered Bengal government never formally declared a state of famine. This was not a bureaucratic oversight. Declaring a formal famine would have legally triggered the obligations of the Indian Famine Code, a set of regulations established in the 1880s that required the government to provide specific forms of relief, including food distribution and public works employment. By never making the formal declaration, the administration avoided those legal obligations. The result was that the official relief machinery was never properly activated during the worst period of the crisis. The provincial government instead relied on ad hoc responses that were entirely inadequate to the scale of what was happening. The British Indian Army eventually took control of relief funding in October 1943, and a record rice harvest in December 1943 helped end the acute starvation crisis. But by then, the death toll was already enormous. The decision not to declare a famine, a decision that had direct, measurable consequences for how much relief was provided and how quickly, was made by colonial administrators answerable to London, not to the people dying around them. Famines across India under British rule. 28. The first major British-era famine killed 1/3 of Bengal's population. 7 years after the British East India Company gained revenue-collecting rights over Bengal following the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the region experienced a catastrophic famine. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 killed an estimated 10 million people, roughly 1/3 of the entire population of Bengal at the time. The connection between the company's arrival and the famine was not coincidental. When the East India Company took over Bengal's revenue administration, it implemented aggressive tax collection policies to maximise the financial returns sent back to England. Tax rates on agricultural land increased significantly. Farmers who could not pay their taxes lost their land. The company's administrators continued demanding full tax revenues even as the harvest failed and people began to die. There was no meaningful reduction in tax collection to help farmers survive the crisis. There was no organised relief programme. Company officials were focused on revenue, not on the well-being of the population they were administering. Historian William Boltz wrote in 1772, while the famine was still a recent memory, that the famine had been directly aggravated by the company's policies. Contemporary accounts described farmers abandoning their fields, families separating in search of food, and entire villages emptying as the death toll mounted across Bengal. 29. There were 31 major famines in 190 years of British rule. Before the British arrived, India experienced approximately 17 major famines in the preceding 2,000 years of recorded history. In the 190 years of British colonial rule between 1757 and 1947, India experienced 31 major famines. The mathematics here are stark. Under 2,000 years of pre-colonial rule, the rate was roughly one famine every 117 years. Under 190 years of British rule, the rate was one major famine approximately every 6 years. Economic historian Mike Davis, who spent years analysing this pattern in his book Late Victorian Holocausts, documented this dramatic increase in famine frequency and concluded that it was directly linked to British colonial economic policies, particularly the insistence on maintaining food exports from India even during periods of acute food shortage, the imposition of free market principles that prevented emergency intervention, and the use of Indian tax revenues to fund British imperial adventures rather than food security infrastructure. India has experienced 0 major famines since independence in 1947, including through severe droughts in 1966, 1973, and 1987. The end of colonial rule and the beginning of democratic accountability produced an immediate and complete elimination of the famines that had killed tens of millions of people under British administration. 30. During the 1876 famine, the British exported record amounts of grain. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 devastated the Deccan Plateau and other parts of southern and western India, ultimately killing an estimated 5 to 6 million people. What makes this famine particularly well documented is that it occurred at a time when British India had a functioning statistical apparatus. Harvest reports, trade records, and export data all survived. Those records show that at the same time millions of Indians were dying of starvation, the British administration was exporting record quantities of rice and wheat from India to Britain. The Viceroy at the time, Lord Robert Bulwer-Lytton, made his position clear from the outset. Food exports were the product of the free market, and the free market was sacred. Nothing, not even a famine killing millions of people in his jurisdiction, would be permitted to interfere with the operation of the market, or with India's export obligations to Britain. His administration continued those exports throughout the worst years of the famine. Grain that could have been used to feed dying people was loaded onto ships and sent to Britain. Famine relief, when it was provided at all, was deliberately kept minimal on ideological grounds, the view that helping people too much would make them dependent on government assistance. 31. British famine relief camps were deadlier than Nazi concentration camps. During the 1876 to 1878 famine, the British colonial administration established relief camps where starving people could go to receive food and work. The camps were based on a policy of hard labour. You could only receive food if you were physically capable of working for it. Anyone in an advanced state of starvation who was too weak to work was turned away. The rations provided inside the camps were calculated to be the absolute minimum required for a working body, and, according to documentation analysed by historian Mike Davis, those daily rations were lower than the documented daily food allocation given to Jewish prisoners inside Buchenwald concentration camp during the Second World War. Davis described the British famine relief camps as extermination camps in all but name. The mortality rate inside some of these camps approached 94%. People who had walked enormous distances in a state of starvation to reach these camps died inside them, fed just enough to continue working, but not enough to recover. The ideological principle driving this policy was that providing generous relief would destroy the Indian peasants' incentive to work. The result was mass death on a scale that would be classified as a crime against humanity by the standards of international law that were developed in the decades after British colonial rule ended. 32. A viceroy banned private charity during a famine. During the Great Famine of 1876, Viceroy Lord Robert Bulwer-Lytton did something that even his contemporaries in Britain found difficult to justify. He banned private individuals and organisations from distributing food to starving people in the famine-affected regions, on the grounds that private charity would interfere with the operation of the free market and discourage the development of individual self-reliance among Indians. This was not a quiet administrative decision buried in colonial paperwork. It was an active policy, enforced by threatening imprisonment for anyone who violated it. At a time when millions of people were dying of starvation within his jurisdiction, the senior British official responsible for their welfare made it illegal for other people to try to help them. Missionary organisations, Indian philanthropists, and well-meaning individuals who tried to distribute food independently were subject to arrest. The full ideological position behind this decision was drawn from the prevailing British economic orthodoxy of the time, which treated the free market as essentially a natural law that should not be violated even in emergencies. The famine was treated as a market phenomenon requiring a market solution, rather than as a humanitarian catastrophe requiring immediate human intervention. Approximately 5 to 6 million people died. 33. India has had 0 famines since Britain left. When Britain transferred power to India in August 1947, one of the most immediate and striking changes in the country's experience was the disappearance of famine. In the 190 years between 1757 and 1947, India experienced 31 major famines. In the 77 years since independence, India has experienced 0 major famines, including during severe droughts in 1966, 1973, 1979, and 1987. This is not a marginal improvement. It is a complete elimination of a recurring catastrophe that had killed tens of millions of people under British rule. Economists and historians have analysed why this happened. The most widely accepted explanation, associated with Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, is democratic accountability. When a government must face voters in elections, it cannot allow large numbers of its citizens to starve without political consequences. The British colonial administration faced no such accountability. Indians did not vote for the viceroy. Indians did not vote for the policies that directed food away from starving populations. Indians had no mechanism to remove from power the officials making the decisions that were killing them. The moment that accountability was created, through independence and democratic elections, famines stopped. The pattern is too consistent and too immediate to be coincidental. 34. Life expectancy fell under British rule. One of the starkest measures of what British colonial rule meant for ordinary people in India is the data on life expectancy. According to research by economic historian Robert C. Allen, life expectancy in India actually declined during the height of British imperial power. In the 1880s, average life expectancy at birth in India was approximately 26.7 years. By the 1910s, that figure had fallen to 21.9 years. This was not a statistical quirk or the result of a single catastrophic event. It was a trend across 3 decades at the peak of British imperial control over India. The death rate rose from 37.2 per thousand people in the 1880s to 44.2 per thousand in the 1910s. More people were dying relative to the population during the height of British rule than before or after. Poverty increased during the same period, from approximately 23% of the population living in extreme poverty in 1810 to more than 50% by the mid-20th century. These figures reflect the lived reality of colonialism for ordinary Indian people, not the railways, not the legal institutions, not the arguments made by apologists for the empire, but the basic human measures of whether people were living longer and eating better. They were not. 35. Britain extracted an estimated $45 trillion from India. Indian economist Utsa Patnaik spent years working through colonial-era trade and financial records to produce an estimate of the total wealth drained from India by the British Empire over approximately 200 years of colonial rule. Her research, published through Columbia University Press, estimated that Britain extracted the equivalent of at least $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938. The mechanism through which this happened was not simply taxation, though taxation played a significant role. The more fundamental mechanism was the way trade was structured between Britain and India. India produced goods, textiles, cotton, opium, rice, indigo, tea, that were exported to global markets. The foreign exchange earnings from those exports should have returned to India. Instead, they were appropriated by the British colonial administration and credited to Britain's accounts. India was then invoiced for its own exports, made to pay for goods it had produced with its own labour on its own land. Over 200 years, this structural drain accumulated to a figure that dwarfs the total of any reparations ever paid by any nation in history. To put $45 trillion in context, Britain's entire annual GDP in 2018 was approximately $3 trillion. The Irish Famine. 36. Food kept leaving Ireland while people starved. The Great Irish Famine lasted from 1845 to 1852 and killed approximately 1 million people. During those years, large quantities of food, including grain, livestock, butter and eggs, continued to be exported from Ireland to Britain. The British government refused to ban those exports, despite having done exactly that during a previous Irish food crisis in 1782, when closing the ports to food exports had rapidly stabilised prices and reduced hunger. In 1845, the political calculation was different. The Whig government in London was committed to laissez-faire economic principles that held it was wrong for government to interfere with the operation of markets, even in an emergency. Free trade meant that if Irish landlords and merchants wanted to export their produce for profit, the government would not stop them. The result was a humanitarian catastrophe in which ships loaded with food left Irish ports while people a few miles away were dying of starvation. This image, food leaving a famine, became the central image of Irish nationalist memory of the event and remains one of the most contested aspects of the famine's history. The debate over whether the British government's failure to stop the exports constituted a moral crime or simply a tragic policy error has continued for over 175 years. 37. Ireland's population has never recovered. The Great Irish Famine reduced Ireland's population with a speed and permanence that has no real parallel in modern European history. Before the famine, Ireland's population was approximately 8 million people. By 1851, just 6 years after the famine began, it had fallen to around 6.5 million. It kept falling for decades afterward as emigration continued. By 1900, Ireland's population was around 4.5 million. Today, the island of Ireland has a population of roughly 7 million, still lower than it was in 1840, nearly 185 years ago. Every other European country that went through the 19th century with a similarly sized population has seen it grow several times over since then. France went from 36 million in 1840 to 68 million today. Germany went from around 33 million to 84 million. Ireland went backwards. The famine killed approximately 1 million people and drove another million to emigrate in a single year, 1847. The wave of emigration it started, primarily to the United States, Canada and Australia, continued for over a century, draining Ireland of its youngest and most capable people, generation after generation. The demographic wound inflicted by the famine and the conditions that produced it has never fully healed. 38. British officials called the famine God's work. The attitude of senior British officials toward the Irish famine was, in many documented cases, one not of horror, but of ideological approval. Charles Trevelyan, the British Treasury official who managed the government's famine relief programme, described the famine as the direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, and argued that the famine was an effective mechanism for reducing what he saw as Ireland's excess population. He believed that interfering too heavily with the famine's natural course would prevent the necessary social and economic restructuring of Irish society. He was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath in 1848, at the height of the famine, partly in recognition of his work managing the government response. Other senior figures took similar positions. Some argued that the Irish poor were lazy and immoral, and that the famine would correct character deficiencies that policy could not. The religious framing, famine as divine judgment, was used to justify the minimal nature of government intervention. While these views were not universal among British officials, they were held by the people with the most direct authority over relief policy. Their ideological commitment to non-intervention and their contempt for the Irish poor shaped every decision made during the worst years of the famine. 39. Queen Victoria donated less than Irish people in Calcutta. The famine relief effort during the Great Irish Famine attracted donations from across the world, from the United States, from Russia, from the Ottoman Empire, and from Irish communities everywhere. Queen Victoria donated £2,000 to famine relief. The Irish community in Calcutta, India, people who were themselves subject of the same empire that was mismanaging the crisis, donated approximately £14,000. A group of Choctaw Nation members in Oklahoma, themselves survivors of the Trail of Tears less than a decade earlier, raised $170 for Irish famine victims, a gesture of solidarity from one colonised people to another that is still remembered in Ireland today. The Ottoman Sultan reportedly wanted to send £10,000 but was diplomatically pressured by British officials to reduce it to £1,000 to avoid appearing more generous than the British Crown. The gap between the Queen's contribution and those of ordinary people and foreign nations speaks to the distance that existed between the British government's formal obligation to its Irish subjects and the reality of how that obligation was honoured. The monarchy's £2,000 donation was not symbolic of a government doing everything it could. It was a number that many people at the time found deeply inadequate, given the scale of what was happening. The Boer War concentration camps. 40. Britain built the first modern concentration camps. The term concentration camp entered modern history not in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, but in South Africa at the turn of the 20th century. During the Second Boer War of 1899 to 1902, the British Army under General Kitchener implemented a strategy to defeat Boer guerrilla fighters by destroying everything that sustained them. British forces burned Boer farms, destroyed crops, slaughtered livestock, and then rounded up the civilian populations, mostly women, children and elderly people, and herded them into a network of camps to prevent them from supporting the fighters. These were the concentration camps. There were 45 camps for Afrikaners and 64 separate camps for black Africans. The term was used at the time in British official documents and press reports without embarrassment, because the concept had not yet been associated with the industrial-scale murder of the Nazi period. The camps were presented to the British public as places of refuge and protection. They were, in reality, places of deliberate overcrowding, disease and death. The scale of what happened in those camps, particularly the death toll among children, shocked some members of the British public when investigator Emily Hobhouse published her findings after visiting them in 1901. 41. 28,000 Boers died in British camps, including 22,000 children. The death toll inside the British concentration camps during the Boer War was enormous, and the demographic breakdown was one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire episode. Of the approximately 28,000 Boers who died in the camps, around 22,000 were children. That means nearly 80% of the Boer camp death toll was children. They died primarily from disease, measles, typhoid, dysentery and pneumonia, spread rapidly through camps that were catastrophically overcrowded, had inadequate sanitation, and provided rations insufficient to maintain health. The camps were not designed with any serious attention to keeping people alive. Space was not allocated on the basis of how many people could safely live there. Rations were not calculated based on the nutritional needs of growing children. Medical facilities were minimal. When disease arrived, it moved through the camp population with devastating speed. Emily Hobhouse, the British campaigner who visited the camps and published a report on conditions in 1901, described what she saw as a death trap. Her report caused a political crisis in Britain when it was published. The government's initial response was to attack Hobhouse's credibility rather than to address the conditions she had documented. A subsequent official inquiry confirmed the overwhelming majority of her findings. 42. The British did not count the black Africans who died. The 28,000 deaths among Boer detainees in the British concentration camps are relatively well documented because the British government kept records of those camps. The black African camp deaths are a different story. Approximately 20,000 black Africans died in the separate camp system that held people who were not Boers. Farm workers, labourers, and other non-white populations swept up in the British military campaign. The British kept substantially worse records for these camps, and the figure of 20,000 deaths is considered by historians to be a significant undercount. The physical conditions in the black African camps were, by most accounts, worse than in the Boer camps. Rations were lower. Overcrowding was more severe. Medical attention was less available. The black African camp detainees were not even accorded the same official concern that the Boer detainees eventually received after Emily Hobhouse's report prompted parliamentary debate. They were not the focus of any official inquiry. Their deaths were not systematically recorded. The 20,000 figure, already enormous, is what could be reconstructed from incomplete records decades later. The actual number of black Africans who died in British camps during the Boer War is likely higher, but will probably never be precisely known. 43. British troops burned farms, crops, and killed livestock across 2 countries. The Scorched Earth campaign conducted by General Kitchener's forces during the Boer War was one of the most comprehensive, deliberate destructions of civilian agricultural infrastructure in modern military history up to that point. British columns swept systematically across the South African Republic and the Orange Free State, burning farmhouses to the ground, destroying stored grain and animal feed, pulling up crops, poisoning wells, and killing livestock. The objective was to remove everything that could sustain Boer guerrilla fighters in the field: food, shelter, fodder for horses, communication points, hiding places. The effect on the civilian population was total devastation. Families returned to their farms after the war to find nothing standing. Entire farming communities were reduced to ruins. The people who survived the camps came back to bare earth where their homes and crops had been. The economic impact of the Scorched Earth policy on what became South Africa lasted for years after the war ended in 1902. The psychological impact of having watched British soldiers burn down family farms while women and children were marched to concentration camps became a foundational grievance in Afrikaner political consciousness and directly contributed to the rise of Afrikaner nationalism in the decades that followed. 44. The Nazis explicitly studied the British camp model. Historians have documented that when the Nazi regime in Germany began developing its concentration camp system in the 1930s, its architects were aware of and interested in the British camps from the Boer War. The Nazi Party newspaper celebrated the British concentration camp system as an early example of an approach to managing civilian populations that Germany could learn from. This connection does not mean the British and Nazi systems were equivalent. The Nazi camps were designed as instruments of industrialised mass murder in a way the Boer War camps were not. But it does illustrate that the British introduction of concentration camps as a tool of colonial warfare was not forgotten by the people who later took the concept to its most extreme conclusion. The Boer War camps were the first large-scale use of the specific term and the specific practice of mass civilian detention in enclosed camps as a military strategy. When Britain's enemies in the following decades reached for a similar tool, they reached for something that Britain had invented, documented, and used as official policy within living memory. The Amritsar Massacre. 45. British soldiers shot an unarmed crowd until they ran out of bullets. On April 13, 1919, the Punjabi city of Amritsar was under a British military authority that had banned public gatherings following unrest earlier in the month. Several thousand people, estimates range from 10,000 to 20,000, gathered in a walled garden called Jallianwala Bagh next to the Golden Temple. Some were there to protest British rule. Many were farmers and families who had come into town for a traditional festival called Baisakhi and were unaware of the gathering ban. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer arrived with a force of approximately 90 soldiers. Without issuing any warning or order to disperse, he ordered his soldiers to open fire into the crowd. The soldiers kept firing. They did not fire warning shots. They did not fire into the air. They fired directly into the dense mass of people packed into the walled garden. The only exit was blocked by Dyer's troops. People ran, climbed walls, and threw themselves into a well to escape. The soldiers fired for approximately 10 minutes and only stopped when their ammunition ran out. Dyer later testified that he would have used armoured cars with machine guns against the crowd if the narrow entrance to the garden had allowed them through. 46. Between 379 and 1,000 people were killed in 10 minutes. The official British inquiry into the Amritsar massacre, the Hunter Commission, concluded that 379 people were killed and approximately 1,200 were wounded. Indian National Congress investigators put the death toll significantly higher, at over 1,000. The British figure excluded people who died later from their wounds and may have significantly undercounted the total. Whatever the precise number, the essential facts are consistent across all accounts. Hundreds of people were killed in 10 minutes. Over 100 more drowned in a well inside the garden, trying to escape the bullets. Many more were injured and permanently disabled. The dead included women, children, and elderly people who had come into Amritsar for a festival. Dyer personally ordered the specific directions in which troops should fire. He later testified that he aimed fire particularly at the areas where the crowd was densest. He also testified that he continued firing because he wanted the effect to be more than local. He wanted the message to reach not just the people in that garden, but the entire region of Punjab. He wanted, in his own words, to produce a moral effect. 47. The British public raised money to honour the man who did it. After the Amritsar massacre became publicly known in Britain, General Reginald Dyer was recalled from India and subjected to a parliamentary inquiry. The Hunter Commission concluded that Dyer had made a grave mistake and he was relieved of his command. He was not prosecuted. He was not court-martialed. He was allowed to retire. And then something remarkable happened. A significant portion of the British public decided that Dyer was a hero. The Morning Post newspaper launched a public fundraising campaign to honour him as the man who saved India, on the basis that his action had prevented a wider uprising. The British public donated £26,000, equivalent to roughly £1.5 million today, or approximately $1.8 million. The House of Lords passed a motion supporting Dyer. Rudyard Kipling called him the man who saved India. Dyer lived out the remainder of his life in England, publicly celebrated in many quarters, and died in 1927, still insisting that he had done the right thing. The massacre he committed did not produce shame or reckoning in the institutions of the British Empire. It produced a fundraising campaign for the man who ordered it. 48. In the days before the massacre, Dyer ordered Indians to crawl. The Amritsar massacre did not happen in isolation. In the days before April 13, 1919, Brigadier General Dyer had already implemented a series of humiliating collective punishment measures against the civilian population of Amritsar following earlier unrest. One of those measures was the crawling order. Dyer issued a directive requiring all Indian men passing through a particular street in the city to do so on their hands and knees. The street in question was one where a European woman, missionary Marcella Sherwood, had been attacked during the riots. Any Indian man who did not crawl was flogged on the spot. British soldiers were positioned along the street to enforce the order and to administer punishment to anyone who refused. The order remained in effect for several days before the massacre. This was a deliberate act of public degradation imposed on an entire civilian population as collective punishment for the acts of individuals. People who had nothing to do with the attack were forced to crawl through the streets of their own city under threat of being beaten. This is the context in which the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh occurred, not an isolated incident of excessive force, but the most extreme act in a sequence of deliberately humiliating and brutal responses to Indian resistance. The Opium Wars. 49. Opium was the British Empire's most profitable trade. In the 19th century, the single most profitable commodity in the entire British imperial trading system was opium. Not tea, not cotton, not sugar, opium. The British East India Company managed a vast opium production enterprise across the Bengal Presidency in India, controlling every stage of the process, from the cultivation of poppy plants to the packaging of the finished product for export. Hundreds of thousands of poppy plantations operated under company supervision. No farmer could grow poppies without the company's permission. No private business could refine opium without company authorization. All opium was technically company property until it was sold at auction in Calcutta. The company then sold the opium to private merchant traders who took it to China, where they bribed and colluded with Chinese smugglers to distribute it illegally. Illegally because the Chinese government had banned the import of opium. The British government knew this was happening. The British government actively supported it. The profits generated by this system, by growing an addictive drug in India, smuggling it illegally into China, and using the proceeds to buy Chinese goods, were enormous. They funded significant portions of British imperial expansion in Asia. 50. Britain went to war so it could keep selling drugs to China. In 1839, China's emperor appointed a senior official named Lin Zexu to deal with the opium crisis that was devastating Chinese society. Lin Zexu moved to Guangzhou, the main trading port, arrested approximately 1,600 Chinese people involved in the opium trade, and confiscated over 20,000 crates of opium owned by British merchants, which he had publicly destroyed. He then closed the port of Guangzhou to all foreign trade until the British agreed to stop the opium trade. The British government's response was to send a naval military expedition to China. This was a war started by Britain because China had destroyed drugs that Britain was selling illegally in violation of Chinese law. The technological gap between the British Royal Navy's warships and China's military forces was enormous. The Qing dynasty had no comparable naval power and no equivalent weapons technology. British warships could bombard Chinese positions while remaining entirely out of range of Chinese defences. China had no effective response. After 2 years of military defeats, the Qing government was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. Britain had gone to war to protect its right to sell an addictive and destructive drug to a foreign population that had repeatedly said it did not want it, and Britain had won. 51. The First Opium War forced China to give Britain Hong Kong and open 5 ports. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in August 1842 to end the First Opium War, was the beginning of what the Chinese call their century of humiliation. Under its terms, China was required to pay Britain a compensation of 21 million silver dollars, including 6 million to cover the cost of the opium that Lin Zexu had legally destroyed. China was required to open 5 of its port cities: Canton, Shanghai, Amoy, Fuzhou, and Ningpo, to British trade and residents. China was required to grant extraterritoriality to British subjects, meaning British citizens in China could not be tried under Chinese law for any crime. And China was required to cede Hong Kong Island to the British Crown in perpetuity. None of these terms were negotiated. They were dictated to a defeated government by a power whose military superiority it had no means to challenge. The treaty was called unequal by the Chinese because one side was in a position to demand anything it wanted and the other side was in a position to resist nothing. The model established by the Treaty of Nanking, of Western powers using military force to extract trade concessions from China, was repeated multiple times by Britain, France, the United States, and other powers over the following decades. 52. British forces burned one of the greatest palaces on earth. During the Second Opium War, which Britain fought alongside France against China from 1856 to 1860, British and French forces advanced on Beijing and captured the old summer palace, the Yuanming Yuan. The palace complex was one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements in human history. It had been built over more than 150 years by successive Qing emperors and contained gardens, lakes, pavilions, temples, libraries, and an enormous collection of art, manuscripts, bronzes, jade, and porcelain accumulated over centuries. In October 1860, the British commander, Lord Elgin, ordered it to be burned to the ground. Over 3 days, British and French troops looted whatever they could carry and then set fire to the rest. The burning took days. The smoke was visible from miles away. The greatest collection of Chinese imperial art and architecture was reduced to ruins. The justification given was retaliation for the torture and murder of British diplomatic envoys, a real atrocity committed by Chinese forces. But the choice to respond by destroying an irreplaceable cultural site belonging to a civilization of thousands of years was made by the British commander, and it was not universally supported, even within the British military at the time. General Charles Gordon, who participated, later described it as a wicked act. 53. The Second Opium War forced China to legalize the drug destroying its society. One of the most extraordinary outcomes of the Second Opium War was its final settlement. The Convention of Peking, signed in 1860 to end the conflict, forced China to do something its government had been trying to prevent for decades: legally permit the importation of opium into its territory. Britain had fought 2 wars, killed thousands of Chinese soldiers, burned imperial palaces, forced open Chinese ports, and extracted enormous financial concessions, all ultimately in service of a trading system built on selling an addictive narcotic to a population that desperately wanted it stopped. Chinese society had been enormously damaged by opium addiction. Estimates of opium addiction in China by the late 19th century ran into tens of millions of people. Agricultural productivity fell. Government revenues fell. Social cohesion deteriorated. The British government was fully aware of this. Discussions in Parliament acknowledged the damage the opium trade was doing to China. But the revenues it generated for the Indian colonial administration, revenues that funded the British Indian Army and British imperial operations across Asia, were considered more important than the well-being of the Chinese population. It was not until Mao Zedong's revolution in 1949 that China was finally able to declare itself free of opium addiction, approximately a century after Britain first imposed the trade by force. 54. The opium trade funded the British Empire in Asia. The connection between the British opium trade and the funding of British imperial operations in Asia was not incidental. It was structural. The East India Company needed money to run its operations in India, to pay its armies, administer its territory, and fund its expansion. The revenues from selling opium at auction in Calcutta were a crucial source of that funding. When the opium was sold to private traders who then smuggled it into China, the proceeds from those sales flowed back through the system as payment for Chinese goods, tea, silk, porcelain, that Britain imported in enormous quantities. Before opium, Britain ran a significant trade deficit with China, hemorrhaging silver to pay for Chinese goods. Opium reversed that entirely. The Chinese sent silver back to pay for a drug they were addicted to. That silver funded British imperial operations not just in China, but across Asia. Multiple major British trading companies and banking houses that operated throughout Asia in the 19th and early 20th centuries were built directly on opium trade profits. The firm Jardine Matheson and Company, one of the most prominent British trading houses in Asia, still in existence today, was founded on the opium trade and was among its most aggressive proponents. Kenya and the Mau Mau. Up to 320,000 Kenyans were detained without trial. When Britain declared a state of emergency in Kenya in October 1952 in response to the Mau Mau uprising among the Kikuyu people, it triggered an 8-year campaign of mass detention, torture, and collective punishment. The scale of detention was staggering. British authorities officially claimed that approximately 80,000 people were interned. Historian Caroline Elkins, whose research drew on colonial records, survivor testimony, and official documents, estimated that between 160,000 and 320,000 Kikuyu people were held in the detention camp network at various points. Other estimates go higher. The detainees were not soldiers captured in combat. They were not people convicted of crimes in a court of law. They were Kikuyu people, men, women, and in some cases adolescents, who were swept up in mass operations across the colony on the basis of suspicion, community membership, or the accusation of a collaborator. None of them had been charged. None had been tried. Many had done nothing more threatening than be Kikuyu at a time when the British colonial administration was determined to break Kikuyu resistance to colonial rule. They were held in camps that the British government described to the public as rehabilitation centres. 56. 100,000 Kenyans were killed, tortured, or permanently maimed. The Kenya Human Rights Commission, drawing on survivor testimony, colonial records, and historical research, estimated that more than 100,000 Kenyans were killed, tortured, or permanently physically injured during the British response to the Mau Mau uprising between 1952 and 1960. The British government hanged over 1,090 suspected Mau Mau rebels, more judicial executions than Britain carried out in any other colonial conflict. A further 400 people were sentenced to death, but had their sentences commuted. Entire villages were designated prohibited zones where British security forces could shoot anyone on sight. Kikuyu people were killed for failing to stop when challenged by soldiers, for being in the wrong place, for carrying insufficient identification. The official British figures, which recorded far lower numbers of deaths, were based on colonial administration records that are now known to have been systematically incomplete and in some cases deliberately falsified. When the British government fought the 2011 legal case brought by Kenyan survivors, newly declassified documents confirmed that systematic torture and abuse had been known to and sanctioned by the colonial administration in London, not just carried out by local officials acting without authority. 57. The torture methods used in Kenyan camps are documented in detail. The torture methods used by British colonial authorities and their agents in Kenyan detention camps between 1952 and 1960 are documented in extraordinary and horrifying detail in the work of historians, in survivor testimony, in court proceedings, and in the colonial files that were not destroyed before Kenyan independence. Historian Robert Edgerton compiled accounts from multiple sources describing beatings and kicks as initial interrogation methods, followed by electric shock applied to various parts of the body, fire, forced drowning, and the insertion of objects, including gun barrels, bottles, and implements, into detainees' bodies. Men were castrated with pliers. Women were subjected to sexual assault. Detainees were beaten with clubs, whipped, burned with cigarettes, and, in documented cases, dragged behind vehicles. Some interrogators, according to survivor accounts, simply shot anyone who refused to answer, then told the next detainee to dig their own grave before questioning began. These methods were not the unauthorized actions of a few rogue individuals. Telegrams between the Kenya colonial government and Colonial Secretary Alan Lennox Boyd in London documented that officials at the highest levels of the colonial administration were aware of what was happening. In 2012, the British government formally acknowledged that Kenyans had been tortured under colonial authority. 58. Men were castrated. Women were violated. The victims lived to tell it. The people who experienced what happened in British Kenya's detention camps did not only survive as statistics. Many survived as human beings, who eventually had the opportunity to tell the world what was done to them. In 2009, 5 Kenyan survivors brought a legal case against the British government for colonial-era torture. Among the 5 original claimants, 2 had been castrated during their detention. The legal proceedings included documented testimony from a man named Ndiku Mutwiwa Mutua, who described in court exactly what had been done to him. Women testified about being assaulted with bottles. Men testified about having their genitals crushed with metal instruments. These testimonies were given in a British court with legal representation under oath. The British government initially contested the case and attempted to have it thrown out on procedural grounds, arguing it was too late to bring such claims. The courts allowed it to proceed. In 2013, Britain agreed to pay £19.9 million in compensation to 5,228 Kenyan survivors of colonial torture. The first time Britain had ever compensated anyone for colonial-era human rights abuses. The payment was made alongside a statement acknowledging the abuse. It was not accompanied by a full legal admission of liability. 59. None of the 150,000 detainees had been charged with a crime. One of the most fundamental facts about the British detention camp system in colonial Kenya is this: the tens of thousands, and by some estimates over 150,000, people held inside it had not been charged with any crime, convicted of any crime, or given any legal process whatsoever. They were detained under emergency regulations that allowed the colonial administration to imprison anyone it chose to classify as a suspect. The standard for detention was not evidence of criminal activity. It was the decision of a colonial official, a screening team, or in many cases a local informant with personal motivations. People were held for years in camps characterized by forced labor, systematic violence, and deliberate degradation. To be released, detainees had to pass through a process of confession and what the British called rehabilitation, admitting to having taken the Mau Mau Oath and demonstrating acceptance of British authority. People who refused to confess were classified as hardcore and subjected to intensified abuse. The entire system, mass detention without charge, forced confession, physical coercion, violated the fundamental principles of law that Britain simultaneously claimed to be the world's leading exporter of. The contradiction was visible in the gap between what was said in the House of Commons and what was happening in the camps. 60. Britain systematically destroyed the evidence before leaving. As Kenyan independence approached in 1963, the British Colonial Office implemented a systematic program to remove or destroy colonial documents that might be used as evidence of crimes against the Kenyan population. Top-secret files were classified in a special category. Documents were marked for European eyes only. Files were physically burned. Colonial officials received explicit instructions about which categories of material should be destroyed before the transfer of power. The operation was not a rogue act by individuals trying to cover their own tracks. It was a coordinated institutional decision made at the level of the Colonial Office in London. Some documents were shipped to Britain rather than handed over to the incoming Kenyan government. Others were simply burned on site. The existence of this destruction program was not publicly known for decades. When the Kenyan survivors brought their 2009 legal case, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office initially claimed it could not find the relevant files. Subsequent investigations revealed that thousands of documents from the Mau Mau period had been stored in a secret archive at a government facility in Hanslope Park, rather than transferred to the National Archives as required. Their existence only became known because of the legal case. The contents of those files, when they were eventually disclosed, confirmed what survivors had been saying for 50 years. 61. Britain paid compensation but refused to fully apologise. In June 2013, British Foreign Secretary William Hague stood in the House of Commons and made a statement about the treatment of Kenyans during the Mau Mau emergency. He acknowledged that Kenyans had been subjected to torture and ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration. He expressed sincere regret on behalf of the British government. The government agreed to pay £19.9 million to be distributed among 5,228 Kenyan survivors. For many observers, the statement and the compensation represented a significant moment, the first formal British acknowledgement of, and payment for, colonial-era torture. But Hague was careful about what he did not say. The statement did not constitute a full legal apology that would have admitted the British government's current legal liability for those acts. It did not open the door to further claims. It did not address the tens of thousands of other survivors who were too old, too ill, or too poorly documented to be included in the 5,228. It did not commit to any broader reckoning with the colonial record in Kenya or elsewhere. The British government's position was carefully constructed to acknowledge the historical truth while legally limiting its financial and legal exposure going forward. The survivors who were not included in the settlement received nothing. India's partition, 62. One man drew the border between India and Pakistan in 5 weeks. In June 1947, British lawyer Sir Cyril Radcliffe was handed one of the most consequential assignments in modern history. He was asked to draw the borders that would divide British India into 2 new independent countries, India and Pakistan. He had 5 weeks to complete the task. He had never visited India before. He had no detailed knowledge of the religious, cultural, ethnic, or geographic realities of the regions he was dividing. He worked from maps and census data in New Delhi, frequently without access to people who had actual knowledge of the areas he was drawing lines through. The borders he drew cut through the Punjab and Bengal, 2 of the most complex, densely populated, and multi-ethnic regions of the subcontinent, in ways that made little geographic, cultural, or practical sense. Communities that had lived together for centuries were suddenly placed on opposite sides of international borders. Families were separated. Sacred sites were cut off from the people who considered them their own. The partition lines were announced 2 days after independence, meaning the new borders became real before anyone had time to prepare for what they would mean. Radcliffe reportedly never returned to India and refused to discuss his work there for the rest of his life. 63. The partition triggered the largest mass migration in human history. When the borders between India and Pakistan were announced on August 17, 1947, the human consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Approximately 10 to 20 million people found themselves on the wrong side of the new international borders. Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan, Muslims in India, and began moving simultaneously in both directions. The scale of this movement had no precedent in history. It was not an orderly migration. It was a terrified, chaotic, violent mass displacement of people who had days or weeks to move before they were classified as foreigners in the country where they had been born. The violence that accompanied the migration was extraordinary. Religious communities that had coexisted for generations turned on each other with horrifying speed. Trains carrying refugees were stopped and their passengers massacred. Villages were burned, women were abducted and killed. The death toll from the violence of partition is estimated between 200,000 and 2 million people, depending on the methodology used. The refugee crisis created by partition took years to stabilise. Many families were never reunited. The trauma of the event shaped the political identities of both India and Pakistan for generations, and contributed directly to the wars the 2 countries fought in 1947, 1965, 1971, and 1999. 64. Britain divided the subcontinent along lines that guaranteed decades of war. The decision to partition British India along religious lines, Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan, was not simply an administrative choice about how to transfer power. It was a decision with foreseeable, and in many cases foreseen, consequences. British officials knew that dividing the subcontinent on communal religious lines would produce mass displacement and violence. Some warned about it explicitly in the months before independence. The Viceroy's staff debated different approaches to the transfer of power. The decision to proceed with partition on a compressed timeline, giving communities weeks rather than years to adjust, was made in London and Delhi by people who would not be living with the consequences. The borders drawn by Radcliffe created a Pakistani state in two non-contiguous pieces, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, separated by 1,000 miles of Indian territory, an arrangement that was geographically absurd and politically unstable from the first day. East Pakistan eventually became Bangladesh after a war in 1971 in which an estimated 3 million people were killed. The partition of 1947 created fault lines that produced 4 Indo-Pakistani wars, the ongoing Kashmir conflict, and a nuclear standoff between two nations that are still technically in a state of hostility over 75 years later. 65. The Palestine problem was also a British creation. India was not the only territory where British departure created a conflict that has lasted for generations. The modern Israel-Palestine conflict is rooted directly in British colonial policy in the Middle East. Britain controlled Palestine under a League of Nations mandate from 1920. During this period, it made contradictory promises to both Jewish and Arab populations about the future of the territory. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 had pledged British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. British officials simultaneously assured Arab leaders that Arab political rights in Palestine would be protected. These commitments were mutually incompatible. In 1937, the British Peel Commission concluded that the two communities had irreconcilable political demands and recommended partition. In 1947, facing a violent conflict it could not resolve and an empire it could no longer afford to maintain, Britain announced it was ending its mandate and handing the problem to the newly created United Nations. It left on May 14, 1948, less than a year after it had also left India, without a functioning agreement on the future of the territory. The First Arab-Israeli War began the same day Britain's mandate ended. The conflict that British imperial policy helped create, and failed to resolve, has produced multiple full-scale wars, continuous low-level violence, and a humanitarian crisis that has now lasted for over 75 years. The drain of wealth. India went from 24% of the global economy to 4% under British rule. Before the British East India Company established its foothold on the Indian subcontinent in the early 18th century, India accounted for approximately 24% of the entire world's economic output. It was one of the wealthiest regions on Earth, with sophisticated manufacturing industries, particularly in textiles, that supplied global markets. By 1947, when the British finally left, India's share of the global economy had fallen to approximately 4%. That collapse, from roughly a quarter of global GDP to a 20th, represents the economic dimension of what colonialism meant for India. It was not the result of Indian failure or Indian stagnation. It was the result of deliberate British policies that dismantled Indian industries to protect British manufacturers, that redirected Indian resources toward export production for British benefit, that used Indian tax revenues to fund British military campaigns rather than Indian development, and that structured India's trade relationships in ways that systematically transferred wealth from Indian producers to British ones. British manufacturers, particularly in the textile industry, successfully lobbied for policies that destroyed the Indian textile trade, one of the world's most advanced, so that British factories could sell to Indian consumers instead. 67. A private company ruled hundreds of millions of people. The British East India Company was not a government. It was a corporation. Founded in 1600 as a trading company to import goods from Asia, it gradually accumulated military power, territorial control, and governmental authority across the Indian subcontinent until it effectively ruled one of the most populous regions on Earth. By the early 19th century, the East India Company governed hundreds of millions of people, collected taxes across an enormous territory, maintained its own army, operated its own courts, negotiated its own treaties, and conducted its own wars, all in the name of profit for its shareholders in London. The company operated this way for nearly 100 years as the de facto government of India, with the British Crown providing oversight but not direct rule. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British Crown took direct control from the company, and Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India in 1877. But for the century before that, what controlled India was not a state or a government in any conventional sense. It was a joint stock corporation, answerable primarily to its investors. The people living under its rule had no vote, no legal recourse against it, and no mechanism to appeal its decisions. They were subject to a corporation's authority over their lives, lands, and livelihoods. 68. The East India Company's private army was twice the size of Britain's own military. At its peak in the early 19th century, the East India Company maintained a private army of approximately 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the entire British Army at the same time. This was not a small security force protecting commercial interests. It was one of the largest military organisations in the world, funded by tax revenues extracted from the Indian population it governed and used to expand British territorial control across the subcontinent. When the company wanted to take over a new territory, whether through conquest, treaty, or the doctrine of lapse that allowed it to annex any state whose ruler died without a direct male heir, it did so with this private army. The soldiers in that army were mostly Indian, called sepoys, commanded by British officers. Indian men were recruited, trained, and equipped with company funds to conquer, control, and administer other Indian people on behalf of a commercial corporation based in London. The company's army fought wars in Afghanistan, Burma, and across India. It suppressed rebellions, protected opium shipments, and garrisoned the territories from which the company extracted its revenues. The scale of this military power in the hands of a private company is without precedent in modern history. 69. The Koh-i-Noor diamond was taken from a 10-year-old boy. The Koh-i-Noor is one of the most famous diamonds in the world. It currently sits in the crown jewels of the British royal family. Its history is a direct illustration of how the British Empire acquired wealth from the territories it controlled. The diamond had been in the possession of the Sikh Empire in the Punjab for decades. In 1849, the British East India Company completed its annexation of the Punjab following the Second Anglo-Sikh War. The Maharaja of the Punjab at the time was Dalip Singh. He was 10 years old. Under the terms of the Treaty of Lahore, signed by British administrators acting on behalf of the 10-year-old boy, Dalip Singh was required to surrender the Koh-i-Noor diamond to Queen Victoria. He was also separated from his mother, converted to Christianity, and relocated to Britain, where he grew up far from his homeland. He later tried to reclaim his throne and return to India, but died in poverty in Paris in 1893. The governments of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran have all, at different times, formally requested the return of the Koh-i-Noor. The British government's position is that the acquisition was legal under the treaties signed at the time of annexation, and that returning it would set a precedent it is unwilling to set. 70. Thousands of bronze masterpieces were looted from Nigeria in a single punitive expedition. In February 1897, a British military force invaded the Kingdom of Benin in what is now southern Nigeria. The stated reason for the invasion was to punish the Benin Oba, the king, for his role in an attack on a British trading party earlier that year. The force that arrived at the royal capital found themselves inside one of the most artistically extraordinary civilizations in Africa. The palace of the Oba contained thousands of bronze and brass plaques and sculptures, now known as the Benin Bronzes, that depicted centuries of Benin royal history with extraordinary technical sophistication and artistic mastery. The bronzes had been created over hundreds of years by craftsmen trained in the Benin Guild system. They were among the most advanced examples of bronze casting anywhere in the world. The British soldiers looted them. Approximately 3,000 to 5,000 objects were taken and sent to Britain, where they were auctioned off to pay for the cost of the military expedition. They ended up in the British Museum, the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, the Horniman Museum in London, and dozens of other institutions around the world. For over 125 years, the British Museum held the largest collection. Germany announced plans to return its collection in 2022. Britain's return of its portion has been slow and contested. The scramble for Africa and suppression of resistance. 71. Britain came to rule 30% of Africa's people in 20 years. Between 1880 and 1900, in a period historians call the Scramble for Africa, Britain massively expanded its control over the African continent. At the start of this period, European powers controlled roughly 10% of Africa. By 1900, they controlled approximately 90%. Britain's share of that colonial carve-up was enormous. Between 1880 and 1900, Britain came to rule approximately 30% of Africa's entire population, across territories that ranged from Egypt in the north to South Africa in the south, and from Nigeria in the west to Kenya in the east. This acquisition was achieved primarily through military force, combined with the strategic exploitation of divisions between African kingdoms, the signing of treaties with leaders who often did not understand what they were signing, and the deliberate use of what Bismarck called the Congo Conference principles. European powers agreeing among themselves how to divide a continent they had no legitimate claim to. The African populations who lived in these territories were not consulted. Their existing political structures, land rights, legal systems, and social organisations were either absorbed into the colonial framework on British terms or destroyed outright. 72. Captured Indian rebels were blown apart from cannons during the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which British accounts called the Sepoy Mutiny, and Indian nationalists called the First War of Independence. Captured rebel soldiers faced a punishment specifically designed to cause both terror and religious anguish. British commanders ordered that certain captured rebels be strapped across the muzzle of a cannon and then executed by firing the cannon. This method of execution, called blowing from a gun, had a specific function beyond simple killing. In Hindu religious tradition, the body must be cremated to allow the soul to pass to the next life. In Islamic tradition, the body must be buried intact. Being blown apart by a cannon blast destroyed the body completely and made any form of proper burial or cremation impossible. The British choice of this execution method was therefore deliberately calculated to violate the most fundamental religious beliefs of the people being executed. Contemporary accounts suggest it was used against dozens of rebels, though the precise number is difficult to establish. The executions were sometimes conducted publicly in front of crowds forced to watch, as a statement of what resistance to British authority would cost. The rebellion itself, triggered in part by British disregard for Indian religious sensitivities regarding rifle cartridges, was suppressed after about a year of fighting. 73. Britain used chemical weapons and bombed civilians in Iraq in 1920. In 1920, when the people of Iraq, a territory Britain had taken from the Ottoman Empire and was supposedly guiding toward independence, rose up in rebellion against British rule, the response was brutal even by the standards of the time. The British Royal Air Force conducted bombing raids on civilian targets across the country. British forces deployed chemical weapons against fighters and communities resisting colonial authority. When the immediate fighting was suppressed, the British implemented a policy of collective punishment, under which entire villages could be designated for annihilation as reprisals for continued resistance. Official orders described the goal as the destruction of every living thing within a targeted village, animals and people alike. The 1920 Iraqi revolt killed approximately 10,000 Iraqis and around 500 British and Indian soldiers before it was suppressed. Britain subsequently installed a compliant monarchy and maintained effective control over Iraqi oil revenues while nominally granting independence. The use of air power and chemical weapons against civilian populations in Iraq in 1920 was a direct precedent for the methods used by other powers, including Nazi Germany, in the following decades. Britain used these methods not against a military power, but against a recently colonised population demanding the independence it had been promised. 74. Churchill personally advocated for using poison gas against populations he considered uncivilised. In a memorandum written in May 1919, while he was serving as Secretary of State for War, Winston Churchill expressed his views on the use of chemical weapons in colonial warfare with exceptional directness. He wrote that he was strongly in favour of using poisoned gas against uncivilised tribes to spread a lively terror. He dismissed objections to the use of chemical weapons against non-combatant populations as squeamishness. He was not describing some future hypothetical. He was commenting on active discussions within the British military and government about the use of chemical weapons in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other colonial territories where British forces were facing resistance. Chemical weapons had been used extensively on the Western Front in the First World War, and their horror was fresh in public consciousness. Churchill's position was that this horror was acceptable, even desirable, when applied to people he classified as uncivilised. The memo is in the British National Archives. It has been cited by historians for decades. It is entirely in Churchill's handwriting and entirely consistent with the positions he took on colonial violence throughout his career. It was written by the man who is still regularly described as Britain's greatest leader. 75. Kenya had prohibited zones where anyone could be shot. During the state of emergency declared in Kenya in 1952, British colonial authorities designated certain parts of the country as prohibited zones. Inside those zones, British and colonial security forces were authorised to shoot any person they encountered without warning, challenge, or any other legal process. People found in prohibited zones could be killed on the spot. This policy was not a battlefield rule applied to active combat areas. It was applied to regions of the Kenyan countryside where the civilian population had been determined to be sympathetic to the Mau Mau movement. People walking to their fields, gathering food, or simply moving through the landscape of the area where they had lived their entire lives could be shot dead for being present. Colonial administration records from the period document numerous incidents of Kikuyu people being killed for failing to stop when challenged, which raises the additional question of whether they always knew they were being challenged, or in what language, before they were shot. The prohibited zone policy was one of several mechanisms through which British colonial authority in Kenya operated entirely outside the rule of law that Britain publicly claimed to stand for, applying standards to African lives that would have been unthinkable if applied to British ones. Propaganda, racial ideology, and institutional racism. Divide and rule was the Empire's primary political technology. Across every territory the British Empire controlled, one strategy appeared again and again in the colonial playbook. Identify existing divisions within the subject population, deepen them, and use them to prevent unified resistance. In India, the British amplified the distinctions between Hindu and Muslim communities that had coexisted, sometimes uneasily but mostly functionally, for centuries. In Africa, the British drew borders that grouped mutually hostile ethnic communities together while separating others. In the Caribbean, racial hierarchies were embedded in legal and economic structures that created competition between different groups. In Ireland, the plantation system imported Protestant settlers specifically to create a settler community with interests opposed to those of the Catholic majority. In Palestine, promises were made simultaneously to Jewish and Arab communities that could not both be kept. The technique worked because it took real differences of religion, language, ethnicity, historical grievance, and gave them political and legal weight that made them harder to transcend. The partition conflicts of India and Palestine, the post-independence civil wars of Africa, the ethnic tensions of the Caribbean, and the sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland are all, in different ways, among the legacies of a political technology the British Empire deployed with systematic consistency. 77. British intelligence ran a covert campaign to incite mass murder in Indonesia. In 1965, the British intelligence services launched a covert propaganda operation from Singapore targeting Indonesia. The operation was designed to incite violence against the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI, which was the third largest communist party in the world at the time. British propagandists created fake newsletters that were designed to look like they came from Indonesian diaspora communities. These newsletters urged Indonesian army generals and civilians to treat the communist movement as a wounded snake that must be killed before it recovers. They called for the communists to be cut out like a cancer. A British-operated radio station broadcasting anti-communist propaganda into Indonesia was part of the same operation. The target of all this effort was Indonesian President Sukarno, who had opposed British plans to combine former British colonies into a Malayan federation, a plan Sukarno correctly identified as an attempt to maintain British colonial influence in the region under a different name. What followed the Indonesian Army's anti-communist purge of 1965 and 1966 was one of the worst mass killings of the 20th century. Estimates of the number of people killed in the anti-PKI purge range from 500,000 to 1 million people. The British government knew about this programme. Evidence of its existence only became public through declassified documents released decades later. 78. Racism was written into the law of British colonies. The British Empire did not rely only on violence to maintain racial hierarchy. It wrote that hierarchy directly into the legal structures of its colonial territories. In Kenya, the most fertile agricultural land, the White Highlands, was legally reserved for white settlers only, barring African ownership by statute. In South Africa, a formalised system of racial segregation was developed under British colonial administration that directly prefigured the apartheid system implemented after the Boer War era. In Australia, the White Australia policy, formally enacted in 1901, was designed to prevent non-European immigration into a British colonial settlement. In Canada, the legal system excluded non-white immigrants to a degree that was enshrined in immigration regulations for much of the early 20th century. In India, separate legal procedures applied to Europeans and to Indians in cases involving both. These were not informal social prejudices that became embedded in practice. They were formal legal distinctions, written in parliamentary legislation and colonial ordinances, enforced by courts and police forces, and backed by the full authority of the state. The message encoded in every one of these legal structures was that the races were not equal, and that the law would enforce that inequality. 79. Indentured labour was slavery under a different name. After the formal abolition of slavery in 1833, the British Empire needed to replace the unpaid labour force that had been running its Caribbean and other plantation economies. The system it developed was called indentured labour. Under this system, workers from India, China and the Pacific Islands were recruited, often under conditions of misrepresentation or outright deception about what they were signing, to work on British colonial plantations under multi-year contracts. The conditions of those contracts typically required the workers to remain on the plantation for the duration, to work for wages so low they could rarely save enough to pay for the return journey home, and to submit to disciplinary systems that included physical punishment for leaving the workplace or refusing to work. Labourers who broke their contracts could be imprisoned. The system transported hundreds of thousands of Indian workers to Fiji, Mauritius, Trinidad, British Guiana, Natal and other territories between 1838 and 1917. Many of them never returned to India. Their descendants became the Indian communities that still exist in those territories today. British colonial officials acknowledged privately that the system was close to slavery. Mahatma Gandhi, who worked as a lawyer in South Africa, described it as such and campaigned against it. It was finally abolished as an official system in 1917. 80. The British Empire puts indigenous people on public display. The British Empire Exhibition of 1924, held at Wembley, North London, was attended by approximately 27 million people over 2 years. It was designed to celebrate the breadth and achievements of the empire and to strengthen the emotional bond between British people and their colonial possessions. As part of the exhibition, living people from British colonies were brought to Britain and displayed to the public as examples of the peoples the empire governed. West African, Southeast Asian, and other indigenous people were presented as curiosities. Their homes, their customs, and their appearance treated as exhibits for British visitors to observe, photograph, and purchase souvenirs about. This practice was not unique to 1924. Throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, the display of indigenous people from colonized territories, in exhibitions, in circuses, in private collections, was a common feature of European popular culture. The people on display were not always willing participants. Some had been brought to Europe under contracts they did not fully understand. Some were children. The exhibitions served a specific ideological function. They reinforced in the minds of the British public the idea that the people of the Empire were fundamentally different from, and lesser than, the British people who came to look at them. That ideology made it easier to accept what was being done in colonial territories in the name of the British Crown. Looting, pillaging, and cultural destruction. 81. The Elgin marbles were taken from Greece over 200 years ago, and Britain still won't return them. The Parthenon sculptures, known in Britain as the Elgin marbles, are a collection of classical Greek marble sculptures that were originally part of the Parthenon temple on the Acropolis in Athens, built in the 5th century BC. In the early 19th century, Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin and British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, obtained permission from Ottoman authorities, who controlled Greece at the time, to remove the sculptures. Between 1801 and 1812, Elgin's agents removed approximately half of the surviving Parthenon sculptures and shipped them to Britain. Elgin sold them to the British government in 1816 for £35,000, after a parliamentary committee debated their acquisition. They have been housed in the British Museum ever since. Greece has formally and repeatedly requested their return since 1983. The Greek government's position is that the sculptures are an integral part of Greek cultural heritage that was removed during a period of foreign occupation. The British Museum's position, backed by the British government, is that it is legally unable to permanently deaccession objects from its collection, and that the sculptures are better preserved and more accessible to global visitors in London. The debate remains unresolved, and Greece opened a new Acropolis Museum in Athens specifically designed to house the sculptures if they are returned. 82. Britain looted the sacred symbol of Asante sovereignty. In 1874, a British military expedition fought its way to Kumasi, the capital of the Asante Kingdom in what is now Ghana, and looted the royal palace. Among the objects taken was the golden stool, Sika Dwa Kofi, which was and remains the most sacred object in Asante culture, representing the soul of the entire Asante people. The British treated it as war booty, a trophy of military victory. They also took enormous quantities of gold and other cultural objects from the palace, before burning much of the royal compound. The British then withdrew, leaving Kumasi devastated. They returned in 1900 during a second military campaign, when the British governor of the Gold Coast demanded that the Asante bring him the golden stool so he could sit on it. Apparently unaware of, or indifferent to, its sacred significance, the Asante Queen Mother, Yaa Asantewaa, led an armed uprising against British authority that became one of the most celebrated acts of colonial resistance in West African history. The British eventually suppressed the uprising and exiled Yaa Asantewaa and other Asante leaders. The golden stool was never handed to the British. It had been hidden. But the looting of 1874 demonstrated clearly how the British treated the sacred cultural objects of the people they conquered. 83. Ethiopia's crown jewels are still in Britain. In 1868, a British military expedition under General Robert Napier marched into the Ethiopian highlands to rescue a group of British hostages held by Emperor Tewodros II at his mountain fortress of Magdala. After a brief and decisive military action, Tewodros killed himself rather than surrender. The British spent 3 days systematically looting the royal treasury and palace at Magdala before withdrawing. They took hundreds of illuminated manuscripts, religious texts, ceremonial crosses, royal crowns, priestly vestments, gold and silver objects, and other cultural treasures that represented centuries of Ethiopian Christian civilization. 15 elephants and 200 mules were needed to carry the loot down the mountain. The objects were shipped to Britain and distributed to various museums, libraries, and private collections. The British Library holds several hundred Ethiopian manuscripts. The Victoria and Albert Museum holds religious artifacts. Windsor Castle and other royal collections hold objects taken from Magdala. The Ethiopian government has formally requested the return of these objects multiple times. Some institutions have returned small numbers of items. The overwhelming majority remain in Britain, over 155 years after they were taken at gunpoint from a country that was never a British colony, during a military expedition justified as a hostage rescue. 84. The British Museum holds 8 million objects from around the world. The British Museum in London holds an estimated 8 million objects in its collection, one of the largest collections of human cultural artifacts in the world. A very significant proportion of these objects came from territories that were under British colonial control at the time of their acquisition, and many of them were not acquired through purchase, gift, or any other consensual transaction. They were taken. Some were looted during military expeditions. Some were taken by colonial officials who claimed them for museums. Some were purchased from local dealers who had themselves acquired them through theft or coercion. The museum's acquisition policies during the colonial era did not require documentation of how objects had been obtained. The result is that the museum is now home to an enormous quantity of cultural material: Egyptian mummies, Assyrian palace reliefs, Benin bronzes, Parthenon sculptures, indigenous Australian sacred objects, objects from China, India, the Pacific Islands, and dozens of other regions, whose acquisition histories range from legitimately unclear to plainly criminal. The debate over whether and how to return these objects to their countries of origin has intensified significantly since the late 2000s, with some institutions moving toward restitution and others, including the British Museum, maintaining that their collections serve the whole of humanity by being accessible in a single location. Torture, detention, and legal mechanisms of control. 85. Collective punishment was a legal tool across the empire. One of the most consistent and widely used legal mechanisms of British colonial control was collective punishment, holding entire communities legally responsible for the actions of individuals within them. Collective punishment ordinances existed in colonial statutes across British territories in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Under these laws, if a village or community was found to have harboured or supported resistance fighters, or if a crime was committed that could be attributed to a particular community, the entire community could be punished through fines, property destruction, livestock confiscation, forced labour, or in extreme cases, the burning of the village. This mechanism served a specific colonial function. It was designed to turn communities against resistors by making everyone pay the price for anyone's resistance. The logic was ruthless and effective. If knowing that a rebel lived nearby meant your crops would be burned and your cattle taken, you had a powerful incentive to report that rebel or prevent others from becoming one. Collective punishment is explicitly prohibited under international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions, which were drafted and ratified in large part during the same period that Britain was applying collective punishment across its empire. Britain signed the Geneva Conventions. It applied collective punishment anyway. 86. Historians found that violence was not accidental in the British Empire. It was the foundation. For a long time, the standard British account of colonial violence was that it represented exceptions to an otherwise benevolent imperial rule, the product of individual bad actors, extreme circumstances, or regrettable but unavoidable responses to native violence. Then, historians started reading the documents. Historian Caroline Elkins spent years working through colonial archives in Britain and Kenya for her Pulitzer Prize-winning book Imperial Reckoning, published in 2005. What she found was not a series of exceptions. She found a consistent system. The same techniques of mass detention, forced confession, physical coercion, and legal suspension appeared again and again across different territories and different decades, in ways that indicated institutional design rather than individual aberration. Her subsequent book, Legacy of Violence, published in 2022, expanded this argument across the full sweep of British imperial history, from the Indian Rebellion of 1857 to Jamaica's Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865, through Palestine, Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus, and Aden. The argument she built was that violence was not incidental to the British Empire. It was foundational, the mechanism by which territory was taken, held, and eventually surrendered. The rule of law that Britain claimed to be exporting to the world was, in its colonies, enforced through a parallel system of violence that the law existed to justify. 87. The same emergency laws were used in colony after colony. When the British colonial administration faced organised resistance in any of its territories, it typically reached for the same legal toolkit. The state of emergency and its accompanying emergency regulations appeared in British colonial governance with remarkable consistency. In Malaya from 1948, in Kenya from 1952, in Cyprus from 1955, in Aden from 1963, in Rhodesia from 1965. Each emergency declaration suspended normal legal protections for the colonial population: the right not to be detained without charge, the right to a trial, the right to legal representation, the right of movement, freedom of association, freedom of the press. Colonial authorities could imprison anyone they chose for as long as they chose, without any judicial oversight. This was not an improvised response to crisis. It was a pre-existing legal framework that the Colonial Office in London had developed and refined over decades, and which could be activated in any territory where the political situation required it. The consistency of the toolkit across multiple territories and multiple decades tells you that what happened in Kenya's camps, in Malaya's resettlement villages, and in Cyprus's detention centres was not the unintended result of local circumstances. It was the predictable output of a colonial legal system designed to give administrators total authority when faced with resistance. 88. 11 men were beaten to death at Hola Camp, and Britain tried to cover it up. On March 3, 1959, 11 African detainees at the Hola detention camp in Kenya were beaten to death by camp guards during what was described as a forced labour operation. The men refused to work, and guards were ordered to force compliance through violence. The beatings that followed killed 11 people and severely injured dozens more. When news of the deaths reached the British public, the initial response from the colonial administration was a cover story. The men had died from drinking contaminated water. The cover story collapsed quickly under scrutiny. The Colonial Secretary, Alan Lennox Boyd, had to acknowledge the truth of what had happened. The Hola massacre, as it became known, triggered a significant political crisis in Britain. Conservative MP Enoch Powell, then a government backbencher and later famous for his inflammatory rhetoric on immigration, made one of the most effective parliamentary speeches of his career, condemning the government's handling of the Hola deaths. He argued that the attempt to conceal the killings and the inadequacy of the subsequent accountability showed that Britain was applying standards in its colonies that it would never accept at home. The Hola massacre contributed to the growing British political consensus that the Kenyan emergency could not continue indefinitely and that independence would have to come. Colonial Wars and Military Conduct, 89. Britain fought over 50 colonial wars in a single century. Between 1800 and 1900, the British Empire fought more than 50 separate colonial wars, military expeditions, and armed campaigns across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. This is not 50 battles. These are 50 distinct conflicts, each with its own name, its own geography, its own death toll, and its own story of a people who resisted British authority and were defeated by it. The list includes the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, the Anglo-Burmese Wars, the Anglo-Afghan Wars, the Zulu War, the Anglo-Boer Wars, the Arrow War in China, campaigns in New Zealand, Sudan, Egypt, Nigeria, Rhodesia, and dozens of other territories. Some lasted days, some lasted years. The death toll in each individual conflict varied enormously, but across 50-plus wars in a single century, the aggregate toll of dead, soldiers and civilians, British and colonial, was enormous. What is most striking is the aggregate, that there was essentially no decade in the 19th century in which the British Empire was not fighting a colonial war somewhere in the world. The empire was never simply a political and economic system. It was continuously, actively, and specifically a military project, maintained through force at all times. 90. The machine gun made colonial warfare almost risk-free for British forces. The extraordinary asymmetry of colonial warfare is illustrated most starkly by the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan on September 2, 1898. A British and Egyptian force of approximately 26,000 men, equipped with modern rifles, Maxim machine guns and artillery, faced an army of approximately 60,000 Sudanese fighters loyal to the Khalifa Abdullah. The battle lasted approximately 5 hours. At the end of it, approximately 10,000 Sudanese fighters had been killed, 13,000 wounded, and 5,000 captured. The British and Egyptian force lost 47 killed and 382 wounded. The Maxim machine gun could fire 600 rounds per minute at the time. A force of Sudanese soldiers, armed primarily with swords, spears, and older firearms, advancing against that firepower, had essentially no military possibility of success. The British commander, General Kitchener, described the outcome as a good day's work. War correspondent Winston Churchill was present and witnessed the battle, and wrote that the carnage of the Sudanese dead was the most significant scene he had ever witnessed. The technological gap between the British military in the late 19th century and the people it was fighting was so extreme that many colonial conflicts were not really battles in any conventional sense. They were massacres, conducted at minimal risk to one side. 91. The British destroyed the Zulu kingdom after Isandlwana. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 began with one of the most catastrophic British military defeats in the entire history of the empire. On January 22, 1879, a Zulu army of approximately 20,000 warriors attacked a British camp at a hill called Isandlwana in what is now South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal province. The British force of approximately 1,300 soldiers and Allied fighters was virtually annihilated. About 1,300 people died in the battle, one of the most significant military defeats Britain suffered in the entire colonial era. The British response was overwhelming. Reinforcements were sent to southern Africa, and a second campaign began. Over the following months, British forces burned Zulu homesteads, destroyed crops and food stores, killed livestock, and executed prisoners. By July 1879, Zulu military power had been broken at the Battle of Ulundi, the capital burned, and the Zulu king Cetshwayo captured. The Zulu kingdom, which had existed as a coherent political entity for generations and had developed one of the most sophisticated military systems in Africa, was broken up into 13 separate chieftaincies under British oversight. The kingdom that had inflicted one of the most significant defeats on the British army was systematically dismantled to ensure it could never do so again. 92. Britain used concentration camps as a military tool at least 4 times. The British concentration camp, mass civilian detention without trial as a tool of counterinsurgency, was not a one-time emergency measure used in a single unusual situation. It was a recurring instrument of colonial warfare that Britain deployed across multiple conflicts over several decades. It appeared in the Boer War in South Africa between 1900 and 1902, where 45 camps for Afrikaners and 64 camps for black Africans held hundreds of thousands of people and killed over 28,000. It reappeared in Kenya during the Mau Mau emergency between 1952 and 1960, where between 80,000 and 320,000 Kenyans were detained. It appeared in Malaya during the Malayan emergency between 1948 and 1960, where approximately 500,000 people, mostly ethnic Chinese villagers, were forcibly relocated into guarded resettlement camps called New Villages, separated from their land and their communities to prevent them supporting communist insurgents. It appeared in Cyprus during the Eoka insurgency in the mid-1950s. The same pattern repeated across different territories, different decades, and different populations. Resistance emerges, emergency is declared, civilian population is detained without trial, coercion is applied to force cooperation or confession. The consistency tells you this was not improvised. It was institutional. Ireland, 93. Ireland was Britain's first colony and the template for everything that followed. Ireland holds the distinction of being the first territory the English crown subjected to sustained colonial settlement and control. The process began in the 12th century with the Anglo-Norman invasion, accelerated through the Tudor period with the plantations, a policy of confiscating Irish land and resettling it with Protestant colonists from England and Scotland, and reached its most systematic form in the 17th century under Oliver Cromwell, and subsequently under the Williamite settlement following 1691. The plantation system took Irish land from the Catholic Irish population and gave it to Protestant settlers specifically to create a settler community with economic and political interests aligned with English rule, rather than with Irish independence. This created the demographic reality of Northern Ireland, a Protestant majority in the northeast, descendants of plantation settlers, that directly produced the 20th century conflict known as the Troubles. Over 3,500 people were killed in that conflict between 1968 and 1998. The border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, a legacy of the 1921 partition, remains a politically sensitive line that complicated Britain's departure from the European Union in 2016 and continues to require specific diplomatic management nearly a century after it was drawn. 94. Irish Catholics were legally barred from almost every aspect of public life. The penal laws imposed on Irish Catholics from the late 17th century onward were among the most comprehensive legal systems of religious discrimination in the history of these islands. Under these laws, Irish Catholics were barred from voting in elections. They could not own land above a minimal value. They could not enter the legal profession. They could not serve as officers in the military. They could not hold any office of civil or state administration. They could not attend or run Catholic schools. They could not teach in schools at all. Mass, the central Catholic religious ceremony, was technically illegal. Catholic priests were required to register with the authorities or face imprisonment. These laws were enforced with varying degrees of rigour over the following century, but their existence codified a legal structure under which the overwhelming majority of Ireland's population, Catholic, Irish-speaking, and historically landowners, was systematically excluded from any participation in the governance of their own country. The land that had been farmed by Catholic Irish families for generations belonged, under the plantation and penal system, to Protestant landlords, who were often absentees living in England and who collected rents from the Irish tenants working the land their families had once owned. 95. The 1798 rebellion was suppressed with documented atrocities. In 1798, inspired by the American and French revolutions and exhausted by decades of legal exclusion and economic exploitation, a broad coalition of Irish people, Catholic, Protestant and dissenter, rose in armed rebellion against British rule. The Society of United Irishmen, led by figures including Wolfe Tone, planned a coordinated uprising supported by French military intervention. The rebellion was partially preempted by British arrests of key leaders, but fighting broke out across Ulster, Leinster, Connaught and, most intensely, in County Wexford. The British suppression of the rebellion was characterised by extensive brutality. Yeomanry forces, locally recruited Protestant militias, burned villages, massacred prisoners, and killed civilians suspected of rebel sympathies with minimal accountability. Estimates of the total death toll from the 1798 rebellion and its suppression run from 10,000 to 30,000 people, in a country whose entire population was under 5 million. In the aftermath, British Prime Minister William Pitt used the rebellion as justification for pushing through the Act of Union in 1800, which abolished the Irish Parliament and merged Ireland into the United Kingdom, without a popular vote of the Irish people, and after a campaign of bribery and pressure on Irish parliamentarians to vote for their own parliament's dissolution. The aftermath and legacy. 96. The borders Britain drew have produced wars for generations. When the British Empire withdrew from its colonies, sometimes through negotiated transfer, sometimes under military pressure, often in rushed and poorly managed departures, it left behind the borders it had drawn. In Africa, The borders established at the Congress of Berlin in 1884, and through subsequent colonial administration, had been drawn by Europeans dividing a map, with no systematic attention to the ethnic, linguistic, religious, or historical realities of the people living within them. The result was a continent full of states that enclosed hostile ethnic groups within the same borders while cutting others apart. In Nigeria, the forced combination of Hausa, Fulani, Yoruba and Igbo populations into a single colonial unit produced a civil war, the Biafra War of 1967 to 1970, in which over 1 million people died, mostly from famine. In Sudan, the border between north and south enclosed communities with almost nothing in common, producing decades of civil war that eventually led to the creation of South Sudan in 2011, and almost immediately to further violence. In Iraq, Syria, Jordan and Israel-Palestine, the borders drawn by the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret agreement between Britain and France to divide the Arab Middle East between them after the First World War, produced conflicts that are still ongoing. 97. Britain often left its colonies without functioning governments. The British Empire's approach to decolonisation was, in many cases, almost deliberately designed to leave newly independent countries in conditions of political and institutional fragility. For most of their time as colonial territories, British possessions had been administered by British officials, governors, district commissioners, judges, military officers, police commanders, with minimal effort to train local people for any of these roles. The assumption embedded in colonial administration was not that local people would eventually run these institutions, but that British people would run them indefinitely. When independence came, often faster than anyone had planned in the aftermath of the Second World War, the departing British frequently took with them not just personnel, but institutional knowledge, procedural expertise, and, in some cases, physical records and equipment. The Democratic Republic of Congo became independent from Belgium in 1960, with approximately 16 university graduates in the entire country. British colonial territories were not always as extreme, but the pattern was consistent. Years of deliberate exclusion of colonised peoples from governance, followed by a handover that left new governments facing enormous challenges with minimal inherited capacity. The instability of many post-colonial states is regularly blamed on the failings of post-independence leadership. The conditions those leaders inherited from the colonial administration are less often discussed. 98. Significant numbers of British people are still proud of the Empire. The British Empire ended within living memory. Its final major chapter, the transfer of Hong Kong, happened in 1997. The Mau Mau detainees, whose torture Britain acknowledged in 2012, are alive. The Bengal famine survivors, whose memories Nobel laureate Amartya Sen drew on in his work, were alive within the last decade. And yet a significant proportion of the British public views this history with pride rather than regret. Surveys conducted in 2016 found that approximately 44% of people in the United Kingdom believed the British Empire was something to be proud of. A 2020 survey found the figure had dropped to around 1/3, still higher than comparable figures for any other major former colonial power. German surveys found that approximately 9% of Germans were proud of Germany's colonial history. The difference in numbers reflects a difference in how these histories have been publicly processed. Germany has decades of mandatory education about its 20th century crimes. The British curriculum has historically not taught colonial history in depth. The result is a population that does not know enough of the detail to form an accurate judgment, and which has been supplied by popular culture and political rhetoric, with a version of imperial history that emphasises the railways and the legal institutions, while leaving out the famines and the concentration camps. 99. Britain has refused to return most of what it took. The list of formal requests made to the British government for the return of cultural objects taken during the colonial period is long and consistently unresolved. Greece has been asking for the Parthenon sculptures since 1983. Ethiopia has been asking for the Magdala treasures since the 1970s. Nigeria has been asking for the Benin bronzes since independence in 1960. India has been asking for the Koh-i-Noor and numerous other objects since 1947. In most cases, the British government and the institutions holding these objects have said no. The legal reason most often given is the British Museum Act of 1963, which prohibits the British Museum from permanently removing objects from its collection, meaning the museum is legally prevented from returning objects even when it might choose to do so. The government has not changed this law. The argument most often made in favour of retaining the objects is that they are better preserved in Britain, more accessible to a global audience in London, and that returning one object would open the floodgates to thousands more claims. Critics point out that this argument was not applied when Germany decided to return its Benin bronzes, or when various institutions around the world have chosen restitution over retention. The decision to keep what was taken is not a legal inevitability. It is a choice. 100. The only time Britain paid for colonial torture was after a court case. The 2013 compensation payment to 228 Kenyan survivors of colonial-era torture did not happen because the British government decided on its own terms to acknowledge and make right what had been done. It happened because a law firm found surviving victims, built a legal case, fought the British government through years of procedural resistance, including attempts to have the case thrown out on time limitation grounds, and eventually won. The British government acknowledged systematic torture, paid £19.9 million in compensation, and expressed sincere regret. It explicitly stated that the payment did not constitute a legal admission of liability, meaning the government was paying money while simultaneously arguing that it was not legally responsible for what it was paying for. The victims were elderly. Many of the worst abuses had been committed against them when they were teenagers or young adults. By the time compensation came, many of those who had suffered most had already died. The 228 people who received compensation represent a fraction of the total number who were tortured, detained, and abused during the Kenyan emergency. For the vast majority of colonial atrocities, in India, in Ireland, in the Caribbean, in West Africa, in Burma, in Malaya, in Palestine, in Sudan, in South Africa, there has been no payment, no formal apology, and no legal accountability of any kind. 101. We will never know the full scale of what the British Empire did. The systematic destruction of colonial records ordered by the British government as its territories moved toward independence in the 1950s and 1960s means that large portions of the documentary history of British colonial rule are simply gone. Files were burned. Archives were shipped to Britain and locked away in facilities that were not subject to normal freedom of information provisions. Colonial officials received instructions about which categories of document were too sensitive to leave behind. The cache of files discovered at Hanslope Park in 2011, files that the British government had insisted did not exist, and that were only revealed because of the Kenyan survivors' legal case, contained documents from Kenya, Malaya, Cyprus, Aden, and dozens of other territories. Their contents confirmed decades of survivor testimony that official British accounts had denied. But those were the files that survived. The ones that were burned are gone forever. The deaths that were not recorded, the villages that were not named in official reports, the prisoners who were never formally logged, the tortures that were never documented, they exist only in the memories of the people who experienced them and the bodies of those who survived. The compensation that was eventually paid, the acknowledgements that were eventually made, represent only what could not be destroyed. The full weight of what the British Empire did to the world will never be completely known. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.